Hi, everybody. I see a couple of people have joined on the live webinar. We are also live streaming on Facebook today, so welcome. My name is Stephanie McGee, and I'm the Director of Education at the Rape Recovery Center. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am so excited to have everyone here today and our guest speaker for our June speaker series. Each month, we try to highlight someone in our community who is working towards ending all forms of violence and who is here to kind of just engage us in a new conversation. So today we have Andi Tremonte. Welcome, Andi.
Hello.
And they will be speaking about ungendering, gendered conversations about interpersonal violence. So I'll let you take it from here. I'll kind of just be in the background if you need any tech support, but I'll mute myself and my video. And for those of you that are joining us, you do have options to either send a question in the chat or through the Q&A. And then for those of you that are on Facebook Live, go ahead, you can submit questions through there. I'll be checking them throughout the webinar. Take it away, Andi.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone who is joining us, who's watching it on Facebook Live. We're going to have a pretty cool conversation today. We're going to talk a lot about gender, and we're going to talk about, these different ways to have conversations about interpersonal violence that is inclusive of, all folks. And, part of that is, when folks are I think I have it listed in here as naysayers, right? When you're having these conversations and folks, may come at you, how do we address that? How do we set boundaries and express our needs and our wants? And also, maintaining, those appropriate boundaries in those interactions. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank the Office of Violence Against Women for, of course, funding us and allowing me to have a job and, do the work that I do, right? So we have an hour today, so I want to kind of, hover around a couple main topics. So the three things that I want to address today is how we as community members, as community educators, as folks who live in a gendered world, how do we view gender? How do we talk about gender? How do we see gender? And how do we have conversations in general with other people that we know, that we care about, that we may love about gender, right? And then we're going to kind of focus on having those non-gendered conversations about gendered conversations. So I had a lot of fun with using the word gender in this presentation, 75 times. So we'll see how that goes. And then of course, naysayers. So we're going to talk about maybe the folks that are saying, hey, why do we have to do this? Why can't we this? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about ways that people oftentimes derail conversations, make the conversation about them rather than the topic at hand. So hopefully give you some tools to, push back against that, right? And set those boundaries. So real quick, I come from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. So we are the federally recognized state coalition for domestic violence for the state of Utah. So that basically means that we're a support organization and we support folks who serve and work with and do direct service with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So do this through a number of ways, mostly through education. I do a lot of, I do a weekly webinar, we do 40-hour core advocacy trainings, site visits, technical assistance. And when we talk about technical assistance on a coalition level, what we're talking about is, folks reaching out to me, other folks, other people on our team, and, asking them, hey, what are the best practices? What's the latest research? How do I, better support da-da-da-da-da? And that's kind of what we do. That's a big part of what we do. So remember, technical assistance on a coalition level isn't calling me and saying, hey, I can't get my mouse to connect to my laptop. I mean, I could probably help you with that, but it's not under my grants, okay? Not under my grants. So here's a little slide about me. Okay, so my name is Andi Tremonte, as Stephanie said. I use they, them, their pronouns, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Coalition. So that means I'm over the education that the Coalition offers. So I do all but like one of the trainings that the Coalition offers. And the outreach part of my job is I specialize in Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA survivors of trauma. So that's mostly what I do for my job. And I think the most important part of this slide is that I'm a Sasquatch enthusiast. So if you've heard the stories, it's true. I love some Sasquatch. I also love Dungeons and Dragons. So here, for example, part of my self-care is I paint the miniatures. And during quarantine, I kind of pushed myself to paint some of my bigger miniatures, and I think I got through 5 of them, and this is the latest one that I finished, and I like it a lot. Here's my sweet boy, Toriko. He is 4 years old, and he's probably gonna walk through the scene a couple times. And then here's Jorge. He is 17, and he is my soulmate. And then this is just another miniature that I've been working on, trying new things, you know, just stepping out of my comfort zone, right? Okay, so I want to start with a little bit of we can make it a writing assignment or a writing, I don't want to say assignment, a little writing activity if you have paper or pencil next to you, if you have maybe a Word document or something on your phone, or maybe you can just think about it for a minute. What I would love for you to do is think for just a minute or so, you know, what does gender mean to you? So if we're going to talk about breaking down binary gender in gendered conversations, we need to first understand how we view and how we see gender. So think about that for a minute. You know, what feelings come up when you're thinking about gender? You know, do you think of maybe happy experiences or positive experiences? You know, does joy, you know, does it elicit joy? Or, you know, feelings of restriction, of, you know, anxiety, irritability. You know, what are those feelings that are coming up when you think about just gender in general, right? What about some experiences? When you think about gender, even if we go more specific, if we think about the binary gender system that we are currently living in, what are some of those experiences that are popping up? Is there an experience that comes directly to mind? Is it harder to think of experiences that kind of pop out that are related to gender? You know, maybe it reminds you of an interaction you had with someone else, maybe friends, family members, things like that, right? What about behaviors? Okay. What behaviors or what behaviors are associated with certain genders? How many behaviors that we, you know, exhibit or that we see in other people have this gender associated with them, right? And how does that maybe affect the way that we view the way that this behavior is seen, this behavior is even done, depending on which, you know, perceived gender is doing it? What about memories? What about memories? And you may be thinking like, what's the difference between experiences and memories? Well, think about experiences as something that maybe has a physical element as well as that emotional aspect of it. Maybe when you think about it, that, you know, an experience for me would be playing in the field across the street when I was a kid, right? There's great memories that are attached to that, you know, the things that we played and the things that we did, but that experience, thinking about that experience and the smells, the way that, you know, the warm summer sun and those dang grasshoppers, that scared me and made me want to not go in that field. So think about that, right? So I would love for folks to type in the chat, you know, what comes to mind when you think about gender. So what's coming to mind? What are you thinking about? Is there a certain feeling that maybe you're feeling? Is there a certain emotion, maybe an experience, right? Ooh, occupational opportunities and associations, social construct. Ooh, societal, expectations. That one's a big one. That one's a big one, right? And that is a big part, these societal expectations and these gender roles and this construct, the way that we construct gender and the binary gender system, it really affects the way that folks who have experienced trauma not only navigate that traumatic experience, but also interact with systems of care, right? The way that people are taken seriously, the barriers that are put up, the access to services, so on and so forth, right? Gender roles, especially as children, right? Oh, saying that your Legos are only for boys, right? Yeah, and even like, disallowing folks from participating in many parts of culture, in many parts of connection. Think about how many connections that we may have lost because of the types of toys that we were allowed to play with and the toys we were not allowed to play with, right? And even the folks that we were and were not allowed to play with. Okay, so, what does gender mean to other people? So think about, so this one, I think might be a little bit tricky for us to do, but I would love if this would be a little homework, assignment that you can do. Maybe you're with people right now, you're watching this with people, maybe in the chat, chatting with other folks, but how do other people view gender, right? So we heard a lot of how y'all view gender. Many of the ways that you were talking about are ways that kind of hold us back, that are restrictive, these roles that we're forced to be in, and how that, potentially has affected the way that we connect with other people and form interpersonal relationships, right? So since we're doing a kind of a virtual thing, I want you to talk to someone else, this week, later today. It could be a friend, a family member, someone that you talk to online, maybe text someone, and ask them these same questions. What does gender mean to you? What feelings, experiences, memories, does gender elicit when we bring up this topic, right? And it's really, really interesting because oftentimes when we're having conversations about just gender, the basics of gender, is we will notice how ingrained gender has been in our experience and how we have navigated our world. Right? So, many of you talked about some of these, restrictive ways that gender has, kind of intersected with our lives. And it's interesting because the ways that I have seen gender throughout my life has been very restrictive, has been, I have been put in this role. And if I step out of this role, if I am maybe more feminine, then I am at risk that I am maybe seen as weak, or I could be targeted, or, feeling disallowed to even tap into femininity, right? And yeah, but then also there are times when gender is so exciting for me. Here's a little secret. I want a pair of high heels. I've never had one before or had a pair in my life. I just want to get high heels. I just want to wear them around my house and sing to my cat. And I just want to do that, right? However, that's something that may not have been as safe to do throughout my life. And that's something that I want to do now, right? All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, and so this third part about, understanding or better knowing how we view and how we see gender is knowing what we know about gender, okay? So we can talk about our feelings, our experiences, and all these different things. We can talk to other people about how they've experienced gender. And a part of it is, what do we know about gender? Where does our ideas about gender, where do they come from? Is it through education, right? I went to school. I minored in women and gender studies. So a lot of the way that even I see or organize thoughts, conversations about gender is oftentimes, related to those, those intersectional feminist ways or ideas, right? So, think about, maybe you've learned about gender through your lived experience, right? And that is incredibly valid. And oftentimes, especially, in the field of, sexual and domestic violence and interpersonal violence, is the lived experience of advocates, victims, survivors, people that are intersecting with systems of care is devalued in many ways. Is, well, you don't have this, and this certificate, so, how are you qualified, and lived experience is incredibly important. We all have lived experience with gender. We all have lived in a gender, this gender binary system that has benefited us in some ways and has also been deeply painful in many ways, right? So that is incredibly important. And if we know that our experience about gender comes from our or our knowledge about gender comes from that lived experience, that's really important to know, because then we can more understand where we're coming from, so that we can better meet people where they are when we're having these conversations about gender. And think about friends and family. In many ways, our gender, how we do gender, how we see gender, even how we perform gender, is dictated by the rewards and the punishments that we receive or we don't receive for these gender appropriate behaviors, the things that we say, the things that we do, right? So think about, within your life, how many times you've been rewarded for, doing these behaviors that was congruent with your gender, right? Where, oh, you didn't play with Legos because they were for boys, and your parents said, oh, it's really great to see that you're playing with dolls. Here's some more dolls, or here's some ice cream, because you're being so good. Think about some of the punishments of having toys taken away, or, physical or emotional, punishments when we are doing things that aren't conforming to our gender. So yeah, these are really, really interesting questions. And how many of us have answered these questions? How many of us have talked about gender, the basics of gender with our friends and our family, right? So all of our interactions are gendered, and it's really interesting, it's like, how can you say all of our interactions are gendered? So I want for you to go through a day, even if it's just the rest of the day, I want you to notice how many of your conversations include this differentiating between genders, or this language, and even the way that we're describing and talking about people, how describing their gender or identifying their gender is important in the way that we're talking and communicating with people, right? It's really, really interesting to see how many of the things that we do are gendered. Like, even the way that I interact with folks in live trainings, depending on who's there and depending on who I'm talking to, my behavior and even the words that I use might change, okay? And being assigned female at birth and the way that I was socialized and some of these behaviors that I still, exhibit, even though I'm like reading all the books and teaching all the classes, is that these things are still incredibly ingrained in us, incredibly ingrained in me. And I definitely can see the ways that my behavior and the words that I use and even the things that I say and I don't say change depending on who I'm interacting with and depending on who is in that group, right? So here, especially when we're having conversations, here's, the first of, I guess, the hot tips is when we want to start to have more inclusive conversations and talk about gender or experience to a wide variety of folks and talk about these experiences in a way that is not excluding other people, but is also honoring our own lived experience, is the first and foremost, the top dot point here is to listen to people's voices, right? And oftentimes, the folks who are being affected by these, gendered conversations are, folks that may not fit in these heteronormative and cis-normative roles and definitions, right? So this heteronormative, this idea that everyone is heterosexual and that those who are not heterosexual are less than or inferior. And then we have cis-normative. So cis-normative would be very similar. It has to do with gender identity. So this, the idea that everyone is cisgender and that those who are transgender are less than or inferior. And, this really is the base of, things like rape culture, right? Because these are the roles and the norms that we have. And when folks don't follow those norms, that, people tend to, justify why they, or even rationalize why they experience that violence. Okay, so we did get a little question here. Do you think that doing a webinar with a very ambiguous gendered audience changes your teaching behavior? That's interesting. That's a really great question. So with webinars, because I don't get the feedback, I don't get facial expressions, I don't get body language cues, I don't get vocal, inflections, the way that things are worded, eye contact, stuff like that, that it is in many ways easier to present because, may not have to worry about that. And that's something that I may not, be pressured by. But also when in person and training with folks in person, having those feedback cues and those, the little bits of information that are given when you're interacting with someone can be really, really telling. So I can change the conversation. I can, reword things or explain things in another way just on the body language of people, if they're engaging, if they're not engaging. And that can be difficult with a webinar, is that I can't see that. But in-person trainings, even if people are not saying, hey, this conversation is making me uncomfortable, I don't know how to talk about this, or talking about gender identity, I'm a little confused. They don't have to say that. I can see that through their body language. I can see that through their level of engagement. So if that kind of makes sense. And it also helps that I'm at my house with my cats and I can sit on my floor. So that does kind of make it easier too. And yeah, so especially when we're having these conversations, making sure that we're listening to these folks, right? We're listening to, folks that are talking to us, that if we are, presenting, if we're having these conversations with folks, that we're not doing all the talking, that we're listening to those folks, okay? And also that we're not speaking for anyone, okay? We can help boost voices. Boosting voices is different than speaking for someone, right? So the difference between empowering and almost like paternalism, right? Where we are making choices and doing things for other folks because we think that it's right for them, right? So empower, not speak over or speak for. So listen, right? Even just listening to someone who you may know or may think that has the same like views as you'll probably learn a lot about that person, and you'll probably learn a lot more than you thought you would, and maybe even some of the ideas or the experiences that they've had surrounding gender. You'll probably learn a lot about that, right? And of course, be transparent. So be transparent in the way that you're speaking, and also let's see, how do I want to word this? Being transparent, how do I want to word this? Be aware of the standpoint, or be aware of the position that you're speaking from, because this could either create additional barriers for folks, or it could break down barriers. And part of that is being, transparent about your position in this, in the conversation, if that makes sense, right? And I mean, that kind of blends into the education piece of this. Is it's not up to folks, marginalized groups, folks who have been, historically pushed down. It's not up to them to teach us how to effectively work with folks, how to effectively serve folks. So there's a huge difference between asking someone, how can I support you? How have you felt receiving services from us, versus I've never worked with one of you. Like, what do I call you? How do I like address you? How do I talk to you? So let's avoid that. Okay, that can be very traumatizing. I know, even part of my job is I'm here to create a climate, a classroom, a setting where people feel comfortable asking really tough questions and being met with trauma, informed answers and support, right? So remember that talking to me and me doing my job and providing this, training service for you is different than talking to folks that you're working with, even friends and family, is that we're not, putting the bulk of that education on them. Okay. And of course, be open to new information. You're going to learn stuff about folks. You're going to learn stuff about gender. You're going to learn stuff about the world that you may have never thought about, or that goes directly against what you have thought about in the past, or things that you have known, right? So, understand that, it is common to have feelings of defensiveness, right? And when we have feelings of defensiveness, that's like our body saying, okay, so something is happening that maybe I'm feeling a little uncomfortable, maybe I'm feeling even unsafe, or maybe I'm feeling, challenged, right? Or sometimes people can even feel attacked. And so taking a moment for yourself and saying, ooh, okay, I'm feeling this. I'm feeling defensive right now. What are we talking about? What was just said? Maybe I can jot it down. Maybe I can write a note in my phone. Maybe I can say to this person, hey, can we take a little break right now and come back to this later, right? Feelings of defensiveness can be a really great way for you to understand that you're being challenged right now, and that something is happening that is maybe pushing against the things that you may have thought about before, or have experienced before, right? So now let's talk about having non-gendered conversations about gender. So I mean, I talked about being trauma informed. Parts of being trauma informed is meeting people where they are, is asking what has happened for that person rather than what is wrong with that person and what does it mean to them, right? And this is really big, especially when we talk about gender. Conversations about gender can be really exciting for some people. They can be really painful and scary for other people. And that, think about when we add that to maybe the level of stress or pressure when we're talking about domestic and sexual violence, that can be pretty overwhelming for many people, right? So this next dot point here is, think about possible barriers that the audience may be facing. So think about, so right now, what are some of the barriers that, we may be facing, or that y'all may be facing in this, little presentation? Well, we're not in person, so it may be harder to ask questions or interact, maybe get more clarification. Also, having that, physical distance could even potentially lack some of that humanization that comes with in-person trainings, right? Is seeing that person in front of you, being vulnerable and talking about gender, even their own experiences, that could potentially be a barrier to make it harder to understand, right? And also think about talking about gender in itself can be a barrier. Talking about domestic and sexual violence in itself can be a barrier. And so how can I, as a facilitator, how can I try and create a space where people, are expanding their ideas or the ways that they have, thought about gender, give them information that's also, supporting them in going through this process, right? So this third dot point is a really hard one, so listen to their concerns. And sometimes this can be really, really difficult, especially when the person is saying or doing things that feel unsafe or are rude. I mean, I don't know how many times that, I've been in a training and someone has come for me and I'm like, okay, what can we do here? Like, what's happening, right? So, part of this and part of being trauma informed is, listening to people where they're coming from. And this could be really difficult because we don't necessarily want to make space for hate speech, these terrible things and ideas that people may be having or using to take over a space and using that to gain power and control over a space. But it's really interesting, especially in my job, is, meeting folks where they are, having these tough conversations, listening to their concerns, finding out what barriers they are facing, and then helping them break down those barriers, right? That can be hard. And especially for, folks within the community, maybe folks who, I do trainings, this is my job. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of my best practices here in a sec, but that can be really difficult, especially for community members and especially for talking with our family members and our friends. And remember that meeting people where they are does not mean that you are taking abuse, that you are sitting there and giving space to harmful, painful, abusive ideas and behaviors. Is that you can set boundaries. So if you're having a conversation with someone and they say something and you're like, oh, can you help me understand why you think that? Or can you help me understand where you're coming from? And they, start attacking you or going off on maybe some really terrible racist, sexist, transphobic, rant or something, then you can say, okay, so it seems like this conversation is not very effective. I think that we should take some time apart and maybe we can come back and talk about it later, something like that. Or just say, I'm not here for it. This is not okay. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm leaving. And so remember that setting boundaries doesn't mean that, the conversation is over. It doesn't mean that the relationship with that person is over. It doesn't mean, all these different things. It could potentially be that, right? Depending on how someone accepts or rejects those boundaries that you're setting. And remember that setting boundaries is healthy, and that you standing up for yourself and you saying, this isn't okay, and I'm not okay with this, that is, part of that relationship, right? And that's part of that interaction that you're having with folks. And also validation is really important with trauma-informed conversations. So especially like when we're talking about gender and folks are talking about gender and even some of their experiences that they've had that have been, more negative or have been hurtful, is that it's okay for us to validate that and say, that sounds like your interaction and your experience with gender and the binary gender system has been really frustrating, has been really painful, right? Or, it sounds like, talking about gender has been something that you've been uncomfortable with, or that maybe you don't understand, or you don't feel like you can talk about it with another person, right? So think about that being said to someone who is maybe defensive about talking about gender, and how that could, kind of, potentially eliminate some of that defensiveness, right? But it's not our job to, necessarily calm every angry soul. Okay, it's not our job. It's not our job. However, there are ways that we can interact with this person that are trauma informed, while also setting boundaries and allowing for future conversations to happen. Right? Okay, so gender neutral narrative. I choose you. So when you're presenting information, when you're having conversations, is that we're starting from the base of gender neutrality, is that we're using non-gendered pronouns. We're using, they, them pronouns when we're talking about folks. We're using the term folks instead of, women, children, men, stuff like that, right? However, it is really important that when we're using statistics, is that we're citing those statistics correctly, right? And unfortunately, many of the statistics that are out there are not inclusive, right? And so that allows for a conversation to happen. So, say we talk about, nationally, it's 1 in 4 men and 1 in 4 women have experienced domestic violence, intimate partner violence in their lifetime, right? And we know through, independent studies that 1 in 5 trans folks have experienced intimate partner violence, because of their gender nonconforming identity, right? And so, think about when we're presenting these numbers that nationally it's 1 in 4 and 1 in 4, right? And then talk about the fact that we don't have enough statistics. We don't have enough information for, folks who don't fall within the binary system, folks who are trans and transgender, or trans and gender nonconforming, is that this is an issue because it oftentimes results in a lack of services and a lack of education and a lack of, direct services. So, it's okay to talk about that and say, this is where we're at right now. These are the things that we can do better. This is what we can do, not only as a group, but this is what we can do as a country, as a community, as an organization. This is what we can do better to increase that access, right? So it's really, it's really important, and it's really great, to have statistics, because when we have statistics and we have these numbers, we get this little glimpse into the issue, and we get this little glimpse of, hey, this is happening everywhere. This is happening in our community, right? And also, sometimes statistics, folks can focus on those statistics and, not be able to absorb some other information. So be mindful of that when you're using statistics, is Statistics are really, really great for including in your presentations, in your conversations about that. Say, these are the numbers. This is happening all around us. But also remember to build upon those trauma-informed ways of communicating with people and meeting people where they are, if that makes sense. So language. Be aware of the language that you're using and its impact, especially the word ally. So the word ally is, totally great. In many ways, this is a way for us to communicate with each other and be like, heck, this person, might be a safer person to talk to come out to have these conversations with. And on the kind of the flip side of that is that oftentimes the word ally is used without doing the work. So it's not enough to attend this hour-long presentation and to consider yourself an ally. It's not enough to attend the webinars or in-person trainings that I do and Rape Recovery Center does to be an ally. It's actually doing the work. It's not only getting that education and, educating yourself on the issues and the folks that we're working with, but also doing it. So you're going out in the community and you're supporting folks, you're breaking down systems of oppression, you're stopping discrimination in its tracks. When people say racist, sexist, homophobic and transphobic things, that you're saying, hey, that's really hurtful. I don't feel that way. And the folks that come here or the folks that that we're friends with, that's really hurtful to them, right? Is that we're standing up for it, right? And remember that standing up for folks, that we're being an ally to, can look different in each situation, right? So when we're working from an anti-oppression lens, we're working from a lens that we're breaking down oppression in everything that we do, right? In everything that we do. And that doesn't stop when the webinar is over. That it's the most important time is when you're not in a training, when you're actually working with folks and interacting with folks. Okay, so down here, this more is more. So when you are talking about folks and there is a gender aspect to it, think about including, like when I do presentations, especially the Two-Spirit and LGBTQI presentation, when we're talking about phenomena and, these things that happen to male, masculine folks, is that we include that, right? Is that not all folks are going to identify as men, not all folks are going to identify as male or boys. Some folks may identify as being masculine, right? So include, maybe more words and more inclusive language in that. So a big one too is when we're talking about survivors versus victims. So some folks identify as survivors, some folks identify as being victims, and also folks may not identify with either of those terms. So, using the is it a phrase? I'm like, I failed 9th grade English, so I don't know. But, like folks who've experienced abuse. So maybe I know that I've experienced abuse as a child or abuse during my life, but I don't identify as a victim and I don't maybe identify as a survivor, but I do identify as someone who has experienced that. So think about ways that you can expand your language to include folks that may be present, right? And then this, folks who have perpetrated or folks with abusive behavior. So this one can be really difficult, is that, humanizing folks who have perpetrated violence against other people. There's a lot of, pushback of saying, oh, the abuser, perpetrator, stuff like that. And oftentimes those are terms that are like perpetrator's term that's used by law enforcement. But, remember that abuse is, a behavior that's oftentimes learned, that's been socialized, and it could potentially be unlearned. And it could be really difficult and problematic to, create an identity for someone as an abuser, it makes it difficult, you know, potentially for that person to change or to, you know, adjust behavior. Think about a perfect example is the word felon. So say someone goes to jail, you know, goes to prison, they have a felony, they have a record, is that, you know, if, you know, they're released, that, oh, well, you're a felon, or, oh, you're a criminal. And think about how difficult it can be for that person to not only reintegrate into society, but find support and to not be seen as this terrible person by something that they may have done in their past, right? So think about this, you know, how can we meet people where they are and humanize all people in the, you know, the cycle of violence, right? Yeah. Okay. So here's a whole bunch of examples. This is wild too, because I got this from Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue knows what's up, I guess, right? But yeah, so a cool one, let's see. So let's see, sibling, you know, I use sibling. When my sister, when she talks about me, she uses sibling. This is interesting, nibbling. I mean, it sounds like something from Futurama, but for a niece or a nephew, right? Instead of those gendered terms. Yeah, and I don't know if there's one for like an aunt or an uncle, and I think that one's a hard one. I think, do you know any of those terms, Stephanie? Because I know there was one. I think there might be a couple. Do you remember any of them for aunt and uncle?
I don't remember.
Dang, okay.
Pibbling. There's one in the chat. Pibbling.
Oh, Kibling?
Pibbling. P-I.
Oh, yeah, okay. Let me pull up chat. There we go. Oh, pibbling, yeah, parent sibling. I love that. I love that. Yeah, another one for like niece or nephew would be sib kid, like your sibling's kid. Like let's be creative, yo. Let's find cool ways to talk about our family members and stuff, right? Woo, woo, woo. Okay, so since we're in kind of a virtual setting and we're kind of, you know, strapped for time because we have an hour, this, again, I want you to try this. I want you to try this today. Your friend, family member, you know, the next person that you talk to, the next story that you tell, I want you to tell that story without using gender descriptors, any pronouns, or binary narratives, okay? So I want you to do it. I believe in you. I'm here for you. Gabrielle is also here for you, but I want you to try it and think about how difficult it is, right? Think about how difficult, especially folks who work with survivors, victims, and folks who've experienced abuse, is that oftentimes that language, those stories are very, very gendered, right? And in many cases, depending on that person's identity, that just talking about their gender identity could out them, could identify them, could be personally identifying information. So think about that, right? And think about consent too. Would this person want you to talk about their story, their experience to other people? Would they want to be identified? This, dang, next time when we can do in-person trainings, I'd love to hear that. Okay. So in our last couple minutes, I would like to talk about so I always know when I'm in a training and someone says, well, hold on a second. Let me play devil's advocate. I know that it's time for me to breathe deep, have a sip of water, like, and just wait for it, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is the third person effect, right? So this is very, very common, and this is the idea that us personally, we are not affected by the narratives, the things that we see on TV and other people, the stories, the gender binary system, all these different phenomena and, you know, narratives that we're hearing, that we're the only person that's not affected by it, but everyone else is, right? And it's actually wild because folks who are affected by this third person effect are folks that are even more affected by some of this information and some of this biased thinking, right? It's because we are ignoring it. We are pretending like it's not a problem when in reality it is actually a problem. So it's a part of, you know, even like denial, right? So think about power and control, and especially when we're talking about things that are so ingrained like gender, that, you know, think about the last time you felt fearful. Did you try and control that situation? Yeah, right? I remember I had a friend that a new friend that I made post or pre-COVID, and it was so terrifying for her, to come over and like just hang out at my house like normal everyday friends would be, right? And so what I did is I tried to control the situation. So I went and I bought, new shelving units, and I organized everything, and I completely redid my front room, and I threw away all this stuff because I felt so fearful and so uncomfortable with allowing a person into my space that I had to control that space, right? So think about how, when we're having these conversations and people are feeling uncomfortable, that this control, these controlling behaviors and this control language might come up, right? Because folks, oftentimes when we're feeling uncomfortable, we try to create a space where we feel more comfortable, right? Number one way is derailing, right? Derailing. So, I mean, this is a form of interruption. It's supposed to not only control the situation, but also refocus those conversations to a topic or a narrative that's more comfortable for that person who is derailing the conversation. So that devil's advocate or that naysayer, right? So here on the screen, we have like one example would be like asking barely related questions, maybe in order to derail that person or to stop the conversation or to focus on a new topic. So for example, there was a webinar that I did recently, and it was about, I think like crisis calls or something. And someone asked a question that didn't really have to do with kind of what we were talking about. And that question could potentially have become a place that we would have gotten derailed in that webinar. However, understanding and knowing what derailment could look like, and also, being a presenter that wants to stay on topic, I, kind of recognize that and like, okay, that's something that we can address really quickly. Like, yeah, here's a basic definition of it, and also more resources will come, right? So that was me setting a boundary, is that, addressing it very briefly, and then also setting a boundary that I will follow up with you with more information. That this is not a part of this discussion right now. This is a bigger discussion that requires, maybe more information and attention or something, right? Okay, I'm sure you've heard this argument of not all ... right? Where when someone is sharing, usually it's when someone's sharing their experience or sharing, again, statistics, or, things that happen to folks in our gendered world, is that someone will generally chime in and say, well, not all, I think a big one is like not all men, not all straight people, or not all, cops or whatever, right? And so this is literally a form of derailing where we are focusing the conversation that is intended to be around the marginalized group, the group that is being affected by this. We are focusing it on the privileged identity, and oftentimes the group of people who is in many ways responsible for much of that oppression and much of that harm, right? And so this definitely goes hand in hand with the free speech argument, right? Oftentimes when we hear this, and especially within my experience, when someone, you know, in trainings or in conversations say, well, not all da da da, and then usually, you know, after I address that and set those boundaries, then the free speech argument comes up. And this is, again, another way for people to derail or to stop these conversations from happening. That, you know, taking things out of context and saying, well, you know, freedom of speech, you know, people should be able to say and do whatever they want. And, you know, a big part of this does come with the fact that people don't understand what free speech, freedom of speech actually means, and what it means in our Constitution, is that the government cannot dictate what you can say and do, right? However, by me standing in front of someone and presenting on a topic, you know, based in empirical research and having these conversations, that's not censorship, right? And, you know, people can say and do whatever they want. If someone says to them, hey, I don't like what you just said, or hey, that's really offensive, or hey, that's really hurtful, that's not censorship. Those are called consequences, right? So if you have free speech, that means that the person sitting next to you also has free speech, right? But this free speech argument is oftentimes used against people who are standing up to things like racism, standing up to things like homophobia, misogyny, stuff like that. So it's used as a way to derail the person, and it's used as a way to, in many ways, effectively stop that conversation. So, you know, be aware of that, is that it's really difficult when, you know, some of these derailing tactics come up, and it is okay for you to set a boundary, and it's okay for you to, you know, maybe step away from the conversation and come back to it. So splaining, splaining, right? So this happens, especially, you know, right now we're having really critical, you know, these really important conversations about race and identity, and the intersectionality of, you know, like our experiences, right? And, you know, think about some of the conversations and some of the folks that are, you know, having these conversations and even leading these conversations is, you know, maybe someone who doesn't have any experience or knowledge about it, but they're trying to explain it, right? In a way for them to maybe feel like they're part of the conversation, or maybe even a way for them to feel like they are not a part of the quote unquote problem. And remember that being anti-racist isn't saying that you are entirely free of racism. You know, part of being anti-racist is, you know, being aware of these things inside of you, inside of other people, hearing it, seeing it, and pushing back from it, and, you know, stopping it and speaking up and saying things, right? Is that we are addressing it in our everyday lives. So yeah, this is I think in our next, yeah, so I want to actually get into this, because we're going to talk about how to 3 tiers of ways to stop these derailing behaviors, especially in conversations and if you're in a professional setting. So we're going to talk about these 3 tiers really quick. Remember that when you're talking with people, and even if you're a presenter or a community leader, you know, activist, educator, is that having these conversations, you're planting the seed, and that not everyone in the room, not every person you're having a conversation with is going to be on board, right? And that they may need more time to think about it or have more conversations, right? So remember that it may start with you just planting the seeds. Okay. So here's some gentle ways to correct people. So you can turn their comment into a learning moment. So I use this a lot. So when people say, well, you know, devil's advocate, or well, you know, this happened to me, I say, oh, that is a good example of victim blaming. So even if they were saying it in a way where they're like, oh no, like, you know, victims need to be held responsible for how they dress or something, that you turn that comment on them, you turn it on them, say, oh, that's actually a really good example of victim blaming. right? Or yeah, that is a common myth surrounding folks who experience domestic and sexual violence, right? So think about how you can turn what they're saying into a learning moment, okay? We don't want to try and embarrass someone. We don't want to be passive aggressive. Remember that we're not trying to hurt that person. We're trying to create an environment of learning and education, right? You can even ask them, like, what do you mean by that, right? Or can you explain more about that? And also, if someone says something problematic, you can repeat their comment, but leave out the problematic stuff. So this perfect example down here, like, oh, that gay checker at the grocery store. And you say, oh, okay, so the checker at the grocery store who you see like every day. So notice how that gentle correction, kind of sent the message that, oh, okay, maybe what I said was just a little messed up. Now, this third one is probably the one that I use the most, is these gentle corrections. Is I repeat what they say, but I leave out the problematic stuff, and then we, talk about it a little bit more. So here's a little less gentle corrections. So you can turn their argument back on them. So asking, so how would that affect the client that you're working with if you said that to them? How would that affect your sibling if they knew that's how you felt? So turn it on them, have them, do some self-reflection and really think about how the things that they say and the things that they do, how that really affects the folks about them, right? And call out inaccuracies in their statement, that if they're like, well, I heard that, or I've known a lot of like lesbians and they just have so much domestic violence, and, that doesn't happen as much in, heterosexual. And you say, oh, let me just stop you there. So the rates of, domestic violence are pretty similar with LGBTQIA folks as it is with heterosexual folks. When we see higher rates, oftentimes that comes with that intersection of things like homophobia and transphobia, and then you can kind of talk about that, right? So this one here at the bottom, this specifically has to do with, it's really interesting. During my trainings, we'll have, many times where folks will share, experiences about working with Native communities, and the common, experience that is, kind of shared is, well, if I go on the reservation and I go into the store, they don't make eye contact, they don't, small talk, and, breaking that down and saying there's a really big difference between, cultural norms, cultural mores and standards, and expectations. So like you're expecting to have this very, white interaction, this very, quote unquote, American, interaction with the checker, and their expectations may be very different, and also their culture is different. So eye contact means something different for them than it does for you, and kind of, hey, whew, let's talk through this. So here's the last little bit. Probably not gentle corrections. So set hard boundaries. So, there have been times that I've been presenting and I've been, talking with folks, and I've had to set hard boundaries. Is that, maybe folks are talking a lot or sharing really explicit stories, or they're saying things that are, offensive, and these other techniques aren't working, that literally say, I'm going to stop you right there, that this is not the space to, say da da da. If you would like to talk more about this, then we can talk about it after the presentation. But right now, those comments are not welcome here, right? So it's okay to set boundaries as a presenter. It's okay to set boundaries when you're educating and speaking with folks. That is, especially if you are a presenter or a community educator, that is your job. Your job is to lead the discussion. Your job is to be one person in front of the room who is, I don't want to say control, but leading leading the group in discussion and education and, furthering their understanding, right? Yeah, so I mean, I just kind of, talked about this, right? Is if there's someone who is dominating space or coming for you, you can first ignore them. So If they raise their hand, you just don't call on them, you look around. If they talk and they keep on talking, even if you're not calling on them, you can say, okay, you know, I love your participation, you know, thank you for participating. Let's see if there's other people who haven't spoken yet who might want to participate. And one of my favorite things now is saying, let me just stop you right there, or let me stop you right there. And even putting your hand up like that could even be like you know, that physical cue to them as well as a verbal cue is let me stop you right there. And then, you know, set a boundary. But yeah, I think that's it. I have like a bunch of, you know, resources in the way of getting a hold of me. Let's see if I can find it. There we go. So here's how to get a hold of me. This is my office line. I will not answer that because I won't be in the office for probably the rest of the year. But if you leave a voicemail, make sure that you repeat your number twice and say your number slowly, and also ask me to call you back. If you don't leave a voicemail, or if you don't ask me to call you back, then I won't call you back because I need to know it's safe to call you. But there's my email address. So yeah, Stephanie, is there anything else? Any other questions or anything I can answer? Or?
I think if our participants don't have any questions, then we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Andi. For those of you that are tuning in, maybe tuned in late, or would like to share or revisit anything that Andi presented today, this should be up on the Rape Recovery Center YouTube in the next day or so. And just check our website and our social media for any future events. We do have a speaker series each month. Due to COVID-19, we're still finalizing the next month, but as soon as we get that up, we will send it out to everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for letting me be here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.